Our scripture reading for this evening will come from Joshua chapter 24, verses, once I get there, verses 14 through 15. Now therefore fear the Lord, and serve him in sincerity and in faithfulness. Put away the gods that your fathers served beyond the river and in Egypt, and serve the Lord. And if it is evil in your eyes to serve the Lord, choose this day whom you will serve, whether the gods of your fathers served in the region beyond the river, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you dwell. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. You may be seated. There are so many things in our life that force us to choose. Just this afternoon, I was forced to choose what I was going to have for lunch. Emily and I went over to my in-laws' house, her parents, for lunch, and I was forced to choose a turkey and cheese sandwich, a chicken salad sandwich, or leftover enchiladas. So naturally, I chose all three of them and had a three-course lunch. There are plenty of things, though, that force us to choose, whether it's simple food like that, whether it's sports and athletic teams. Who are you going to root for? Whose side are you going to choose? Or even things in our life. Where are you going to choose to work? Or are you going to choose to go to school? When you graduate high school, are you going to choose to go on to college? Are you going to choose to go straight into the working force? There are so many things that cause us to choose, and with all of these options, there is no wrong answer, which is why you can have a three-course lunch, because there is no wrong answer. Wherever you work, wherever you attend school, whatever direction of life you choose, there is no wrong answer. Except for one thing. There is one thing in life that you can make the choice about, and there is a definite right or wrong answer. And that's whether or not you choose God's side. Tonight, we're going to be looking at a few different aspects of choosing God's side. The first thing is whether or not you are on... Is this thing on? Whether or not you are on God's side. Y'all might just have to click for me. I'll just point to you whenever it's next slide. All right. If you choose God's side, there's a couple of things you need to know. Because this is a really serious decision. This is, like I said, the only decision that is either right or wrong. Because everything else in life, every other choice that you make, there is no wrong answer. It's just opinions, whether or not you prefer chicken salad sandwich or turkey and cheese. Everything else in life, wherever you work, wherever you go to school, whatever sports team that you decide to cheer for, all of those things are just a matter of opinion. But this is a matter of right or wrong. If you choose God's side, the things you need to know is that you cannot be lukewarm. We read about that in Revelation chapter 3, verses 15 through 17. That's one of the most well-known passages about being lukewarm. It was to the church in Laodicea that it was wrote by John as he was inspired by the Holy Spirit, that they were lukewarm. They weren't either hot or cold. And because of that, God wanted to spit them out of his mouth. What that looks like for us today is someone who appears to be Christian, someone who looks like they're a Christian, someone who knows exactly what pew to sit in, and yet doesn't live like a Christian. That's called being lukewarm. And if you choose God's side, you cannot be lukewarm. If you are lukewarm, then you're automatically not choosing God's side. We also see an example in James chapter 3, verses 10 through 12, about making a decision to be on God's side or not. Another thing you cannot be if you choose God's side. Are you coming up to look at this? Another thing you cannot be if you choose God's side is you cannot serve two masters. We read about this a couple of times throughout the gospel accounts. Matthew records it as well as Luke, when Jesus tells his disciples that they cannot serve both God and money. They have to choose. They have to make a choice. And this is a choice of right or wrong. This isn't just an opinion. It's not a matter of saying, okay, well, I'm going to put God second, and that's still putting him high, but he's right behind something else. This is not a matter of opinion. It's either right or wrong, because if you're not all for God, he's going to spit you out of his mouth. If you try to serve two things at the same time, then God says, you're not a part of me. We also can't serve any other gods in this life. There are plenty of things that try to claim their place as God over our life. And you're going to notice here, I put a little g, because there is only one God. But there are so many other little gods. All throughout the Old Testament, we read about these little gods that tried to steal the Israelites away from the one true God. You can check in Exodus 20, verses 3 through 6, Deuteronomy 6, Deuteronomy 8, Jeremiah 25, over and over, and that's just a few. There are numerous times when God tells his people, if you choose other gods, I will destroy you. If you choose other gods, you have no part with me. If you choose other gods, I will wipe you off the face of this earth. It's not an option to choose another God. It is a matter of right or wrong. If you choose another God, one of those little g gods, it leads to just pain and hurt. Because only the one true God that we know and worship is the one that offers salvation. Through him, he offers this family. Through him is why we have these brothers and sisters sitting next to you. None of those other little g gods offer that. But it's not only what you cannot do. It's a matter of what you should be doing if you choose God's side. Because there is a task for us. We can't just choose God's side and say, yep, I'm going to ride on the coattails of those who've gone before. We can't just say, I'm going to choose God's side and sit here until Christ comes home. We can't just say, I'm going to choose God's side and do nothing at all. There are responses that have to be made. There are things that we have to do when we make the decision to choose God's side. You see on the screen passages of Isaiah chapter 6, verse 8, 1 Samuel chapter 3, verse 4, and Exodus chapter 3, verse 4. Well, all three of those passages have in common, I find so fascinating and yet so encouraging at the same time, that these three men, generations apart, each one of them generations apart, all have the same response when they are called by God. In Samuel, 1 Samuel chapter 3, verse 4. Most of you are familiar with this story. Samuel is being raised by an older priest, and at night, Samuel hears a voice calling, Samuel, Samuel. So Samuel runs into Eli's room, and he says, did you call me? And that older priest, Eli, said, no, go back to bed. So Samuel goes back to bed, and once again he hears the voice calling, Samuel, Samuel. So Samuel runs to Eli and says, I know you called me this time. I heard the voice. And Eli said, no, I did not call you. Go back to bed. And finally, Samuel hears the voice calling him, Samuel, Samuel. And his reply is, here I am, Lord. In Isaiah, When Isaiah is called, his reply is, "Here I am, send me. I'm ready to work. I'm ready to be on your side. I want to be on your side. I want to fight this spiritual war. I want to fight for you." But in Exodus chapter 3, verse 4, when Moses is before the burning bush and he hears a voice, his response is not, "Here I am, send me. Here I am, I'm ready to work." His response is, "Here I am, who's calling me?" Because out of this burning bush, God is calling to calling to Moses, and Moses does not want to work. After Moses is talking to God here, he gives excuse after excuse after excuse. So many times we say the right words. We say, "Here I am," but it is coupled with excuse after excuse after excuse. We act the part. We talk the talk. We look like we are ready to fight the spiritual battle. We are ready to be on God's side, but then it falls right in line with excuse after excuse after excuse. Is your "Here I am, Lord, send me"? Or is your "Here I am" calling my brother Aaron? What is your response to choosing God's side? Our response has to also be understanding that it's not our side. It's not our own side. And we make this mistake far too often of thinking that God is on my side. I can win this battle because God's on my side. I'm sorry, but he's not. You're on his side. God doesn't choose sides. He tells us we have to choose a side. It's either God's side or not God's side. If we are on God's side, then of course he's fighting for you and he's with you. But it's a matter of you choosing his side, not him choosing your side. In Colossians chapter 3, verse 12, James 4:10, we see examples of how we're instructed to be humble because God is the one that's in control. But I want you to focus on Joshua chapter 6 and 7 because this is exactly what I'm talking about with us choosing God's side rather than God choosing our side. You see, in Joshua chapter 6, in the beginning of chapter 6, Israel defeats Jericho. They have just crossed over into the river beyond the Jordan. They have come into the promised land. They have marched around Jericho for 7 days, and the walls came tumbling down. And so the Israelites are thinking, this is great. We know exactly what we're doing. We're going to come in and conquer this land. We're feeling great about ourselves. Look at us. We're warriors. All we had to do was walk and this wall fell down. And so when they come to the next city, this city's name is Ai. And they see it's a smaller city. And they think, we can conquer this city, no problem. We don't even need all of our men to go up for this battle. And so in chapter 7, they rise up and go into this battle. And pay attention to what it says in Joshua chapter 7, starting in verse 2. Joshua sent men from Jericho to Ai, which is near Beth-aven, east of Bethel, and said to them, go up and spy out the land. And the men went up and spied out Ai. And they returned to Joshua and said to him, do not have all the people go up, but let about 2,000 or 3,000 men go up and attack Ai. Do not make the whole people toil up there, for they are few. They're thinking, we've got this. This is no problem at all. We're going to be able to conquer this city with no problem. But guess what happened? They returned defeated. They were run out of town. They were whooped in this battle to try to conquer Ai. When we continue reading throughout Joshua, we understand the reason that they were whooped is because after they had defeated Jericho, one of the men from the camp of Israel stole some of the possessions from Jericho when they were commanded to destroy it all. He kept behind some of the gold and other precious items from the city of Jericho and hid them under his tent, thinking nobody would ever find out. And so when they go to battle against Jericho, with sin in their camp, God was not with them. They thought God was on our side, but God said, no, I don't choose sides, but you have left my side. This sin that was in your camp has caused you to leave my side. I never left you, you left me. Those are the words that God says to us. Whenever we're crying out thinking, where is God? Why has he left me? I thought I chose God's side. God says, I never left you. You left me. And then he says, please come back. When Israel realized that there was sin in their camp, they got rid of it. The man who had stolen these things from Jericho and his entire family and all their possessions, their flocks and their herds were all stoned. Israel removed the sin from their camp because it was more important for them to be on God's side. Just before this, in Joshua chapter 5, we understand very clearly the difference between God being on our side and us being on God's side. In chapter 5, verses 13 through 15, before Israel conquers Jericho, it's back before they conquered Jericho, before that sin entered their camp. Starting in verse 13, it says, when Joshua was by Jericho, he lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, a man was standing before him with his drawn sword in his hand. And Joshua went to him and said to him, are you for us or for our adversaries? Listen to verse 14. And he said, no, but I am the commander of the army of the Lord. Now I have come. I can almost see it, and it makes me so excited when I read passages in Scripture where you can almost visualize things that are happening. But Joshua sees the commander of the Lord before him, and Joshua is trying to figure out, is he going to be fighting for us? Is he going to be fighting with us, or is he going to be fighting against our enemies? And so Joshua asks the question to the commander of the Lord's army, and he says, are you for us or for our adversaries? And I can almost see the answer. It's like, no, what are you talking? I'm not choosing sides here. That's not what's happening. I am the commander of the Lord's army. It's your job to choose my side or not my side. I don't choose sides. It's almost like the commander of the Lord's army is disrespected here because Joshua is asking him, are you choosing our side? Because it's a matter of choosing God's side. When we understand this fact that it's about choosing God's side and not him choosing our side, that response, that humility is what keeps you on God's side. I want to talk a few more things, more than just you choosing God's side. I want to talk about your family choosing God's side. We know it's important for each one of us as an individual to make the choice of whose side you're on, whether it's God's side or whether it's not God's side. But it's so important to make the choice for your family to choose what side you're on. Joshua chapter 4, verses 14 through 28. I read 14 and 15 before we started the lesson. When Joshua is towards the end of his life, he passes away shortly after he says these words, at least about an inch in my Bible. That was a joke, but Joshua passes away shortly after he says these words of, choose this day who you will serve. And it's coupled with, if you're not going to serve God, if you are going to deny him, if you're going to turn against God, then you have to choose who you're going to serve. Because everybody serves somebody. You can't choose nothing. And so Joshua says, if you're not going to serve God, then tell me now who you're going to serve. Just choose now. Are you going to serve those gods back in Egypt? Are you going to serve any of the gods that these pagans worship here? Who are you going to serve? But as for me and my house, we are going to serve God. We are going to serve Yahweh. Each one of us has to make the decision for our families. Who are we going to raise our kids to worship? Who are we going to raise our kids to love? Because there are so many options out there. There are so many things, whether it's academics, athletics, school, the pursuit of college, the pursuit of a career, the pursuit of friends, and having a good social life. There are so many things that we can, through our nonverbal language, show our kids that we worship. You have to choose before you are faced with any kind of situation, before you are faced with any kind of conflict. You have to make the decision. Who are we going to serve? And if it's not God, just choose now. Just as Joshua said, if you're not going to serve this God that has led us through the land of Canaan, that has conquered this land for us, go ahead and choose now. Who else even is worthy? And in that sarcastic comment from Joshua, everybody obviously realized there is no one else that's worthy. And so the Israelites' response in verse 16, the people answered, "Far be it from us that we should forsake the Lord to serve other gods. For it is the Lord our God who brought us and our fathers up from the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery, and who did those great signs in our sight and preserved us in all the way we went, and among all the peoples through whom we passed. And the Lord drove out before us all the peoples, the Amorites who lived in the land. Therefore, we also will serve the Lord, for he is our God." You have to choose. You have to choose for yourself. You have to choose for your family. Once you make the choice of who you're going to serve, we're instructed in Ephesians chapter 5 of how we're to treat one another. If you choose God's side, if your family chooses God's side, then once again, it's just like yourself. You don't get to say, "I choose God's side," and ride coattails to the end. You don't get to say, "I choose God's side," and sit on the pew until Christ comes home. You cannot say, "I choose God's side," and do nothing. You cannot say, "My family chooses God's side," and do nothing. So in Ephesians chapter 5, all the way through the end of chapter 5, starting even into chapter 6, we're instructed with how we are to treat one another when we are on God's side. We are to submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. It's because of our love for Christ that we submit to one another. It's because of our reverence for Christ that we honor one another. And that word submit has so many poor connotations to it, about being underneath, about being a servant. And I don't know why, as Christians, we don't see that as a good thing. We don't see that word submit as that's exactly what Christ did. He submitted to death, even death on a cross. And yet when we read that word submit to one another, we think internally, we don't always say out loud, sometimes we do, but we don't always say out loud, "I don't want to submit to other people." If you choose God's side, you also choose how to treat one another according to God's rules. The final thing that I want to look at is asking, whose side are your brothers and sisters on? And I'm not talking physical brothers and sisters, because we just talked about that, choosing whose side your family is on. This is choosing whose side are your brothers and sisters sitting next to you on. In Deuteronomy chapter 28, verse 14, we are instructed by Moses as he gives the law to the Israelites to not turn to the right or to the left, to follow the law. There are so many people out in the world. So many people who genuinely call themselves brothers and sisters in the church who are trying to pull the church to the right or to the left. And I'm telling you right now, Moses gave us a warning of wisdom thousands of years ago. Do not turn from what I have commanded you. Do not turn from this book right here, whether it be to the right or to the left. There is not one side that's better than the other. But instead, it's God's side. And if you're not on God's side, then you've got so many other options. And you might as well just go choose another option. It's either God's side or not God's side. I want you to ask yourself, whose side are your brothers and sisters on? But evaluate that with what the brothers and sisters in the first century looked like. When you talk about the church, you have to ask yourself, who does the church belong to? When you talk about the church, you have to understand that there's only one church, because Christ purchased one church. In Matthew chapter 16, verse 18, we read about Peter's confession. The church is the one that is built on that confession. The church is the one that confesses that Jesus Christ is the Son of the living God. In Acts chapter 2, verses 1 through 47, we read about the day of Pentecost, when the church was established, when the church began, with thousands of souls being added to the church, after being pricked to the heart when Peter helped them understand that they crucified the Son of God. The church is the one in Acts chapter 2, verse 42, that is devoted to the apostles' teaching and to the breaking of bread and the prayers. The church is the one in Acts chapter 20, verse 28, that Christ purchased with his blood. There's only one true church. It's the one he purchased with his blood. We'll be told so many other things when we leave this building. But if you ask your brothers and sisters sitting next to you whose side that they are on, they're either on God's side, Christ's side, the church that Christ purchased side, or they're not. We also need to bear one another's burdens. When you ask yourself, whose side are you on? If you're on God's side, if your brothers and sisters are on God's side, you need to be bearing each other's burdens. In Galatians chapter 6, verse 2, in Colossians chapter 3, verse 16, we understand this relationship. We read in Ephesians chapter 5 all the way through chapter 6 about the family relationship, how we should be submitting to one another, how we should be treating one another. And in Galatians chapter 6, we read about the brother and sister in Christ relationship. That is picking up those who have fallen down. That is supporting those who need help. But one more thing I want to talk about in regards to whose side your brothers and sisters are on is the idea that you just run away when things get tough. If you're on God's side, you cannot run away when things get tough. I've heard people say, in reference to their brothers and sisters, in reference to their congregation, that they aren't living right, so I'm just going to go somewhere else. They aren't acting right, so I'm just going to go somewhere else. Or even, I'm just going to go nowhere. I can't find a church that is an example of this first century church that we read about, that we just looked at, the true church that Christ purchased. People will say, I can't find that today, so I'm just going to stay at home. People will say, that just doesn't exist where I live. I'm really glad they didn't say that in Corinth back in the first century. Because you know that church in Corinth struggled with more things within the church than I can't even fathom sometimes. We read in chapter 1, right when Paul begins his letter, he starts scolding them about being divided over men. People would say, I follow Paul. No, I follow Apollos. And Paul is just flummoxed. He doesn't understand. How can you say you follow mere men when you know that Jesus Christ purchased this church? But they weren't just arguing about it. They were actually divided over it, according to 1 Corinthians 10 through 13. Then we continue on in the letter of 1 Corinthians to the church in Corinth, that they were even tolerating incest. A man had his father's wife. But not only that, in chapter 6, they were bringing lawsuits against one another. They were suing one another. They were bringing internal problems in the church out in the public, out where everyone can see, to people that weren't even Christians. They were asking them to judge and come to solutions. They were tolerating sexual immorality, specifically the sleeping with prostitutes, as mentioned in 1 Corinthians chapter 6. The one that blows my mind more than anything else, though, is in chapter 11, when Paul is correcting them on how to partake of the Lord's Supper. They were just abusing what we were given by the Lord to remember his death until he comes. They were turning it into a common meal instead of a memorial feast. So Paul corrects them on that in chapter 11. And then if you read through chapter 13, or 12, 13, and 14, you see that they were arguing and shaming one another on who had the best spiritual gift, about who could preach the best, who could encourage the best. Today, the problem that we are faced with is not a problem of whose side are my brothers and sisters are on. It's a problem of not being true brothers and sisters. Because if you run away, then that's not what God intended. If you're running away from problems rather than standing up and saying, let's work through this, let's fix this, let's try together, let's strive together, let's bear each other's burdens to come to a solution. But if you say, wow, I can't go there because they're not living right, or I can't go anywhere because they're not living right, that's just not what we're instructed to do. That's just not choosing God's side. There are so many things that we can look at, so many examples that we can think about as far as whose side are you on, whose side is your family on, and whose side are your brothers and sisters on. But that passage that we read a bit ago in Joshua chapter 5, verses 13 through 15, is the one that I want to stick in your brains tonight. When Joshua is before the commander of the Lord's army, and he asks, are you on my side? And the response is, no. Of course I'm not on your side. You're on my side. I feel like we subconsciously have this discussion with God every day. As far as the things that we choose, the places that we go, and the things that we do. But every other option, every other choice in your life is opinion-based. There is no wrong answer. But when it comes to your relationship with God, there is a right and a wrong. Tonight, if you are on the wrong side of that right and wrong, I plead with you to not remain there. If you need the prayers of the saints and the encouragement that these brothers and sisters can bring, I promise you there is not a better time to ask for those prayers and that encouragement. If you want to be added to the Lord's church, that one that he purchased with his blood, tonight there is not a better time to do so. Whatever your need may be, I encourage you to come as we stand and sing.